This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 135. Were Mum and Dad right about saving?
In this edition of the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen, we look at savings. What good are savings? Do we really want people to save rather than spend? And what happens to money when we do save it? That's coming up on today's edition. Now, in the early 80s, 10% or more of all our household resources went into savings. The rest obviously went on food, housing, holidays. Since then, we've spent a lot more on housing, a much lower proportion on food and drink, even though we're fatter, but we're just spending more generally. And savings has almost completely been wiped out. And why wouldn't it? I mean, interest rates are negligible. It's not really worth saving. And a recent survey has shown that 1 in 4 adults in the UK have no savings whatsoever. So it's a mind shift, isn't it, Steve? For our nest eggs that we used to have, which we used to save up for, like our parents taught us, to now borrowing to invest or simply trying to pay off our excessive mortgages faster. And no wonder we're not saving anymore. So should we be concerned, or doesn't it really matter?
Yes, we should, but for entirely opposite reasons to the usual worries, which are the ones you've just expressed. Because if you look at the whole thing comes down to what are savings. And there's two elements of that. One is, which we'll talk about later, is the mechanics of what actually happens when you save money as an individual in a monetary system. But the other is how are savings defined in the national accounts.
Yeah.
The way savings is defined is the gap between income and expenditure, which is fair enough. Mm-hmm. But what do they include in expenditure? They do not include paying your mortgage.
Right.
Okay.
And I guess on the income side as well, they probably are not counting what you've taken off to contribute to your pension, because that's sort of like your pre-tax amount. So you're reducing your income to invest, really. Yeah,
but that's the other side of it. But what you have is money you use to service your debt, and certainly money you use to pay it down doesn't turn up in your costs. I'm not sure about the interest payments, so I'd better clarify that. I'm certain about money you use to repay the debt you've got. So if you're servicing your debt, then that is not counted in your expenditure. That's not consumption. I think also the interest payments on housing are not counted as part of consumption. So what you find is that what is defined as savings, a large part of it is actually what you do to service your financial obligations. Now, because the level of debt, say in the UK, for example, has trebled since Maggie Thatcher and was almost quadrupled at one point, then you've got higher servicing costs. Which means what appears as savings itself is being eroded. It isn't really savings. It's servicing the financial sector. So if you ask people, do you want to save money? Most people would say yes. If you want to say, do you want to service the financial sector? Most people would say no. Well, unfortunately, the term of savings includes both. Right. Then the other side of it is, as you mentioned yourself, the increasing cost of housing, but also the increasing cost of utilities. Now, that's the first one, again, is caused by the financial sector itself. The trebling and quadrupling of debt in the last 30 or 40 years has driven up the cost of housing, whether you're renting, less if you're renting than if you're owning, which of course you're owning, the costs as an owner have escalated dramatically. And the problem of utilities is a special one, because, of course, what we now have, if you go back 40 years and say what were we spending on utilities as you've done, it was substantially lower spending now. What has happened across that time? We've privatised huge slabs of them. This is supposed to reduce their costs. What's happened? The cost has gone up. Because it was a textbook model of how the costs would change, which ignores, for example, the cost of marketing, which of course doesn't exist when you have a state monopoly, but is a major expenditure when you break it down to a bunch of privatised competitors.
But when we look at how much everything is costing us, we then get back into that conventional argument, don't we, about what is savings? Savings is basically what you've got left over when you've paid for everything that you've earned in income. But I wonder how much of it really is this shift is just as we started to discuss a change in definition, because what is the difference between savings and investment, for example? As I said, if I take money out of my pay packet for a pension fund, isn't that exactly the same as putting money into a savings account, except, I'm putting it into shares rather than sticking it in the bank? I'm probably going to get better returns. And in government figures, I've probably got a lower income from doing that because the money's been taken off to invest, so it's not being taxed. But I get more assets. I'm not getting savings, but I'm getting more assets, and I probably feel better off as a result of that.
Well, there's quite a bit of complicated issues there because, again, we think about the way mainstream economists think about investment and savings. They think savings comes first. You've got to save to invest. And actually, the way in conventional neoclassical thought, and certainly in the old classical, some of the classical school writers, but certainly, say, Jean-Baptiste Say, who was a proto-neoclassical, the idea was that whatever you save is necessarily put aside for future investment.
Yeah. We don't do that now. We borrow to invest. We do the exact opposite.
And this is what Keynes, when he wrote the general theory, said there were three sources of demand for money. There was precautionary demand, speculative demand, and transactions demand. And the neoclassical model was exclusively focused upon transactions demand. It didn't look at the other two. So that was what Keynes saw as a major innovation. And he also argued that investment causes savings. So if you look at how it's defined in the national accounts, on the production side, you'll say GDP, or GDP is consumption goods produced plus investment goods produced. And then on the expenditure side, you'll say expenditure measure of GDP is purchasing of consumption goods plus purchasing of investment goods. Well, what you've got in the C's being identical, what you produce is what you sell in terms of consumer goods, then therefore you get an equality of savings to investment. And this has been a major part of macroeconomics, whether it's mainstream or non-mainstream. And I'm actually pissed off with it because I think it's a major source of confusion. But what Keynes realised in 1937, I think it was a paper called the Alternative Theories of the Rate of Interest. And in that, either that paper or the General Theory of Employment, which, by the way, anybody who hasn't read Keynes, I would not recommend reading the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. I wouldn't recommend reading the book. I'd recommend reading the paper, just called The General Theory of Employment, which is written in 1937. It's 15 pages long. You can find it for free on the internet. It's much, much better. Now, there's three papers Keynes wrote in 1937, and in the main they were responding to critiques of the general theory by his mainstream rivals. Of course, at this stage, they were pretty much in disarray because of the length of the Great Depression, the Roosevelt recession, which had begun in America as well. But people like Patinkin came back at Keynes from a neoclassical point of view. Keynes called it classical. We would call it neoclassical today. And in that debate, Keynes realised that he'd left out the financing of investment. And he said, there's a fourth demand for money, which I now think, quote unquote, should have included in the general theory, and that is the finance demand. It may well be that the finance demand for money precedes investment, and the investment generates the savings. So this is the major hook that Minsky drove his theories forward on. So by leaving out the finance demand for money, you leave out what actually causes investment.
Well, and isn't that clearly what is happening now? Because the incentive is there. So because if you save your money and put it in the bank and then you invest it, then when you're saving it, you're getting very low interest rates. So you've also got the question which has become more of a concern over the last 10 years, that your money is sitting in the bank. If you're borrowing and investing, then it's the bank's money which is at risk, not your money, and you probably feel a bit happier about that.
Well, this is another trick, and this is another one of the areas that the accounting approach I'm now taking to the foundations of the way I think about the monetary economy is essential, and that is that when you look at the aggregate of an economy, I'm going to make start with the fiction of a pure credit economy. So economy with no government money. This is the sort of what you might call the libertarian wet dream. Okay, government doesn't exist. All banks are private, and then all money is created by private banks. And that's the real libertarian wet dream, of course, is that everything in money is gold. We all go out and dig up. We go out to the Californian fields and dig up our slab of gold, or that sort of thing. So the commodity money. I'm not going to go quite that loony right, but I'll stick with the loony right that argues we should just have totally private banks and no government money creation. Well, in that world, we're talking about financial assets. The law of accounting applies, and that is that assets minus your liabilities equals either what you call your capital or your equity. I prefer to call it your equity. So assets minus liabilities equals equity. Now, to become a bank, you have to have positive equity. You have to raise capital in the first instance. Let's say you raise, £1 billion. You've got to raise that money, and then you can become a bank. Now, of course, at the moment we talk about licensing the bank. Let's just imagine that doesn't happen either. But you've got to raise that billion in the first instance. Because you therefore have assets of $1 billion, and if you imagine starting out as a bank, you have assets of $1 billion, you have no liabilities because you haven't borrowed any money, nor have you lent any money, so you don't have any depositors whose accounts are your liabilities. Your assets minus your liabilities equal equity, which is $1 billion. Now, when you look at the rest of just take that bank in isolation and look at the rest of the planetary financial system, because one person's asset, whether it's an entity or a bank, what doesn't matter in this instance, one person's asset is another person's liability. The sum of the equity for the rest of the planet is precisely $1 billion, negative $1 billion. Okay, so if you look at the banking sector in general and in a pure credit economy, then the banking sector must maintain positive equity. Therefore, the non-banking sector must have negative equity. Okay. Now, what that means is we don't actually so consciously do this, but this is what's actually going on. Because we each individually have a desire to have positive equity financially, we want to have more assets than liabilities. We try to do it by financial speculation.
Yeah. Now, we assume that those assets are going to go up in value.
Yeah, that's right. Well, imagine you've got two columns in your levels of assets. One is the cash you hold, whether that's in a bank account or physical cash. And the next column is your ownership of assets. Now, how do you price those assets? You price them by the price the last asset sold for times the entire stock of assets that exist. This is the fallacy that lets us pretend we're in positive equity when there's an asset bubble.
But if we have growth, if an economy is growing, then won't we see, and populations are growing as well, I guess, which is a discussion for another day. We're going to do that next time. But let's assume static population. But if we've got growth, then assets will increase in value, won't they?
Yeah, assets. Well, this is the trouble. Assets will increase in price when there's debt financing the value of. This is the circularity that I want. Right.
So that's onto a good thing. Then everyone wins. That's what we set out to achieve. Rather than So what could possibly go wrong?
Well, this is the trouble. We're happy for delusional reasons because we think. What we do is we start from a position of negative equity. When you're working in a pure credit world, we have the banks having positive equity, the rest of us have to have negative equity. Now, we don't like that, so what do? We go along to the banks and we borrow money from them to go and buy assets. And when you buy the assets, you drive up the price of those assets. And that's something we've covered in previous podcasts, and I'll be hopefully publishing a paper on it later on this year with some empirical proof of that using at least American data. But what lets us believe we have positive equity through an asset bubble is that what we do as a common practice is we work out the value of those assets and record them in our little double entry bookkeeping as the asset alongside the cash we've actually got. So to borrow money, our cash goes down. We borrow money from the bank to, we'll put a deposit to go and buy a property somewhere. We value the assets at the price they're selling for times the entire outstanding stock of assets. Now, if we all tried to sell at that price, the price would collapse.
Yeah, it'd be like a bank run for assets, in effect.
Yeah, bank run for assets would definitely happen. Now, what we instead do on a normal basis is we sell between 2 and 10%. It's a sort of extremes. Between 2 and 10% of existing houses turn over every year. Now, if we value the total value of assets on our books at that level of the 2 to 10% that sell, we get a far lower valuation for our assets. We wouldn't be fooling ourselves to believe the impossible, that we can all be in positive equity. But that's to give you an illustration. But imagine, let's say there's 10 million homes in the UK, and the average price of those that sell, the 2 to 10% that sell, is £200,000. Then you get two million pounds as the valuation of the housing stock. And we all think, woohoo, we're copying. If you look at all the people who've got houses and you add up the equity they've got, add to the negative equity of those that don't, and so on, bang, you come up with a positive equity situation for the non-bank sector and a positive equity situation for the banks as well. Whoopee-doo, we're all happy. However, I said if we tried to liquidate that value, the prices would collapse. A more realistic valuation for us to all use and say what are the actual value of our assets is to multiply that fictional value by the actual percentage that turns over. Now, if you do that, let's say it's 5% of the housing stock turns over every year, then rather than getting 2 million, you get 100,000 million. 1/20th the valuation that you see otherwise, which is more realistic because that's what actually could be sold. That's roughly the turnover, the annual turnover in the property market. So if we did that, we'd never believe that assets are going to make us positive net equity because that's just the amount of transactions that are being financed.
So presumably that would mean we'd borrow less to make those investments because the return is going to be less grand.
We'd stop seeing housing as investment to begin with.
Right. Yeah. And we would save more. We'd look at alternative means. But then that's housing. I mean, does the same thing apply to other assets like investing in shares? Yeah.
This is the scary thing about again a lot of shares. If you go to a broker and say you want to buy some shares, it might take 2 minutes before they suggest, you haven't really got enough capital here. Why don't you take out a margin loan with us and you can get wonderful gearing out of your property. You put down 100,000, and back in the old days and back when Irving Fisher went bankrupt, the margin loan ratio was 10%. So let's use that because that's what caused that's what really made the Great Depression great, was the widespread use of margin loans by most of the large slab of the public, including ultimately in that, how do you pronounce it? Apocryphal apocryphal?
What?
I can never get.
What? As in predicting the future?
Yeah.
Yeah, just say predicting the future. It's a lot easier.
Okay. When I think Rockefeller hopped into it and the bellboy was telling him which shares to invest in, he said, when the bellboy tells you what shares to buy, it's time to get out of the market. Well, at that stage, most people who are in the market are taking out a margin loan, and that margin loan was predicated on asset and share prices always rising. Yeah. And what you do, and let's take Irving Fisher's case, because this is literally what he did. If we adjust the amount of money he was using to year $2,000, then he had $10 million that he put into the stock market because he actually became quite wealthy by selling his invention of a Rolodex because he was a tinkerer as well as a professor of economics. He invented the Rolodex, that was the iPad of the time, sold it to the Rand Corporation, made for a substantial amount of money plus shares in Rand. So he's on the board of Rand and a number of other corporations. And he had $10 million in the stock market, which he had put on margin. So he had $100 million worth of shares. Now, the danger about a margin loan as opposed to a mortgages are dangerous enough. But with margin loan, you are required to maintain the value of the portfolio. So if you put in 10 million, take out a 90% margin loan, you've got 100 million worth of shares. If those shares go up by 10 million, then you double the money you've put in minus your servicing cost on the margin debt. That's what attracts people in. Yep. If they go down by 10%,
you owe money you haven't got.
You've gone from a portfolio worth 100 million to a portfolio worth 90 million, and the share, according to the margin contract, the broker is quite entitled to ring you up and say, "Excuse me, your level's fallen below. You have to put an extra 10 million in." If you haven't got that 10 million, they'll sell your children. Yeah, there's no limits to the amount of money the margin.
So is all this telling us that our mum and dads were right, that we should, because this thinking that we are going to borrow to invest rather than save? Mum and dad were right, weren't they? I mean, the old days where we were said, yes, save for a rainy day, which people don't think of now. And in fact, there's a bit of research showing that basically, I think it's 1 in 4 households in the UK. Don't actually no. Here we are. It's from Choice last year, and it's Australia. 1 in 4 Australians say they couldn't raise $3,000 if there was an emergency and they needed that money drastically. So we don't have that liquidity anymore because we haven't been saving. We haven't been putting money in bank accounts. And perhaps, and just, another angle to think about as well, maybe part of that is, and we mentioned that, it's because it's our money we're putting into banks, which feels less secure than borrowing from the banks. Just think back to the whole situation in Cyprus just after the, the global financial crisis. Anyone who had more than 100,000 euros sitting in the bank, the bank would, were grabbing a significant chunk of that to try and pacify the EU, basically. So, savings aren't secure necessarily.
Well, that's one of the worst decisions ever made by the European Union to do that, and that's really, believe me, that's a stiff field. That's a stiff field. But yeah, if you look back to what our parents were doing, not only were they being frugal, so you had lay-by in those days rather than having credit cards, so you'd be putting money. And I vividly remember my mother going through this for some item she wanted to buy. You'd put a deposit down of maybe 5% of the purchase price, and every week you'd go up and pay an extra 5%, and 20 weeks later you'd get whatever you were buying. These days it's all straight onto the credit card. But not only were they doing that frugality back in the pre-bubble world we live in, they were also doing it with a money supply which was much more determined by government money creation than it was by the banks. And this can let's jump out of the little mindset I had of a pure credit market, a credit economy, and now imagine one with the government sector where the government creates money by deficit spending and financing that by purchasing from the central bank. That means there's a large amount of cash in the economy, because when you get a payment from the bank, if you get a loan from a bank, the loan, the money you get in your bank account is precisely matched by the loan you owe to the bank. So you have no change in your net financial assets. That's why we go and then use that money to gamble and try to drive up the price level. But if you have the government creating large amounts of money and you put that in your savings account, that when the money is created and given to you, whether it's through the government buying you services off you, or you're getting a welfare check, or some form of social security benefit and so on, that money doesn't come with an obligation to pay it back. There's no debt to the government for you individually. So the amount of money that can be the amount of money has been generated by government activity coming with zero liability for the individual and a positive asset value, which means we can all be in positive equity. And this is why when I come back to saying, when you look at the wet dream of the libertarians, they haven't thought through the situation that their wet dream means the nightmare that everybody who's not a bank is in negative equity. Now, that is what drives a lot of the weird behaviour we saw in the 1800s, particularly in America, with booms and busts every 10 to 15 years. That regularity. After the after the Great Depression, with the growth in the scale of the Federal Reserve and the growth in government spending as well, government spending in the USA went from roughly 5% of GDP to roughly 30% through the experience of both the Great Depression and the Second World War. That generated a large amount of government money in circulation without the negative equity. So everybody was actually in positive equity. And if you added up your accounts, assets minus liabilities, most of the non-bank sector would find they had positive equity because most of that money was being created by the government turning up in the bank accounts without a liability match to it. They could have positive equity, and so could the banking sector.
But
so on that, yeah.
When I'm living frugally, though, those days when we live frugally, I mean, unless I was sticking the money under a mattress, the money wasn't out of circulation, was it? It
was circulating as well. And this is the other thing about the world we're in right now. I'm going to go to one of my favourite stats, which is not a debt stat. It's a velocity of money stat. This is the money of zero maturity stat maintained by the Federal Reserve. And when you look back at the rate at which money turned over it only starts in about 1959. So it doesn't go right back to when you're talking about.
Oh, that's enough. Yeah.
I was 6 then. Okay, so it's what my parents were doing when I was 6 years old. That stage, the velocity of money in the economy turned over roughly 1.8 times per year. So if you had, let's say, $1 billion worth of money, that would support $1.8 billion worth of GDP.
Yeah.
Now, it remained flat at that level right through the end of 1965, and then it started to rise. And this, to me, was the beginning of the breakdown of the so-called, it's not the Keynesian era, it was the Samuelsonian and Hicksian era of economic policy. But there was a boom, as you might remember, from the mid-'60s on to 1973. And that boom drove up, because the inflation was rising, there was also an increase in the velocity of circulation of money. So by the time we hit 1974, which was I think that's what I record as the beginning of the 1973-74 is my defining moment when we moved from a financially robust society to a financially fragile society. Minsky actually chose 69. I think the end of 73, beginning of 74 is a better date.
But we were saving more, though, weren't we? Because interest rates were high. There's the incentive to save in those days. And you're saying that...
in fact, what you see is an incentive to spend because of the rate of inflation.
Oh, right.
Because,
okay. Yeah.
I say, what you had, as I said, back in the 60s...
But we also had high interest rates, didn't we?
Yeah, well, the interest rates are going up to try to break the back of inflation. But most of that time, interest rates were effectively negative in real terms. So you had and this is what defined the growth of the neoclassical school, because from their point of view, this was the breakdown of the Keynesian philosophy. What they knew of Keynes was textbooks that they read, of course, which Samuelson wrote. But that was their vision. And that's when the whole dominance of the neoclassical school began. But if you look at what happened to the velocity of circulation of money, it kept on rising during that period of high inflation. So went from 1.8 times turnover roughly, which you can regard as the pre-financialization stage of society. Minsky's date, which is pretty useful, that's when it started to trend up. So it started trending up from 1.7 to 1.9, and by the time we got to 1968, it was turning over twice.
But could it also be the cause of the inflation? I mean, the fact that we've got money's ticking over faster, so in effect there's more money. More money as a supply. I mean, couldn't that be the reason for the inflation?
Well, the real reason, I think, was increasing bargaining power of workers, because you had at that stage high employment globally. Australia in particular, an outrageous, outstanding example of high employment policies, with unemployment rate of 1.5% being the average, and anything above 2 was a crisis. These days they'd be throwing a party if they ever hit 2. So I think the wage pressure was driving up prices overall. You also had, of course, OPEC. And OPEC began in 73, 74. So there's lots of factors driving up the price level. But
the mentality in those days, though, was still, wasn't it, that we are going to save. We're going to try and save as much as we can. It wasn't this idea that we're going to borrow to invest. When we started to borrow to invest, that's when we saw that the velocity of money really did start to slow down. So does that mean can we draw a conclusion that if you're saving, that actually helps the velocity of money?
It slows it slows the velocity of money circulation down, because, and this is the other point, when you save, you don't create any money. Yeah. This is the Swabian housewife will be making in Berlin in a couple of weeks' time.
So I can understand the theory of that, but you're saying when we were, but when you were young and when I was young, which obviously are two completely different generations,
a long time ago,
and one or two generations in the middle of there as well. When we were saving, we were seeing the velocity of money higher. I mean, it may be coincidental, but I mean, it doesn't mean one leads to the other. But now we are saving less and we're investing more and we're borrowing more. We're seeing that velocity of money decreasing, which seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Well, let's see. What actually is going on is, because you become, again, you mentioned the people who can't, like the Australia survey, one in four couldn't raise $2,000. What you do as a result of that is you spend even more slowly. Right. And this is the classic story, and this is why Keynes talked so much about the fallacy of composition. What works at the individual level can be disastrous at the collective level. So my classic example is the Titanic. If you want to survive the Titanic, you jump into a life raft. If you all jump into the life raft sinks faster than the Titanic. So you have to have the systemic capability to handle that change, and by definition, once you've hit the iceberg, the systemic capacity is gone if you haven't already built enough life rafts on the vessel. And that is a situation we find ourselves economically, because we are not providing the money from the government point of view without coming so you don't get money coming as an asset without a liability. Everybody's trying to drive up the valuation of the assets they have by borrowing from banks and then leveraging up the high price of assets through that process, which then means when you make your price times quantity of assets outstanding calculation, whoopee-doo, we all find ourselves in positive equity. And that, of course, because it's been driven by the rising level of debt, it comes crashing down in experiences like the 2008 crisis.
Now, Liam Fox, who is the Secretary of State for International Trade, he was the Defence Minister when he said this. This was about 5 years ago, so I'm talking outside his portfolio. He said the government should reduce stamp duty and taxes on bank accounts so that we created a savings investment culture. Is he a bit confused?
Well, for a start, he's got it wrong. As you said, savings investment culture, that's thinking neoclassically. Yeah. You've got to save before you can invest. It's the other way around.
Which is not happening in any case.
You want to finance investment, and that's what hasn't been happening. We've certainly had some investment. This whole bubble began back in 92, 93 with the telecommunications bubble taking off. And that's one of the creative sides of financing, which Schumpeter spoke a great deal about. That you want to provide capital to entrepreneurs who wouldn't otherwise have money, and that's supposed to be the role of the banking sector and also the financial markets. And they were doing that effectively, so there was investment going on. But if you look at the level of investment compared to what it was back in the 50s, then the proportion of GDP that's going into investment, certainly in the UK, is far, far lower now than it was back then. And you're not getting the financing in the very first instance to enable that investment to occur. But if you want to buy a house, we've got some money for you.
But wouldn't the world be a better place if it was, the place that our mum and dad described, where, you've got to save money for a rainy day, and that money you can use as an investment once you've saved it, rather than the way that we are working, which is where we are borrowing to invest, and all the problems that you've created there. So Liam Fox might be wrong, but it's a better place for the world to be, isn't it?
Well, there's another better place, and this is the one that it comes down to the nature of money itself, because the tendency, the desire to hoard money, as Keynes policy, you don't hoard it in terms of taking it out of circulation necessarily, but you spend it more slowly. So the individual desire to have more money in your bank account means you spend more slowly, which means the aggregate GDP falls. Mm. And this is one of the traps of thinking at the individual level and applying it to the aggregate. Your attempt to save money, unless more money is being created in the aggregate, will actually reduce GDP without increasing the actual aggregate stock of savings at all.
But that's the very rich saving, isn't it? That's the very rich. That's the people who say, well, I'm going to hoard money so I stay ahead. So I've got that advantage over everybody else. So I'm going to be right for the rest of my life. That's different from Mr. and Mrs. Average just saving a bit from their weekly pay packet.
That it is. But at the same time, it's in both cases, but more so with the wealthy, you're slowing down the circulation of money and effectively making money less productive. Mm. So one of the most interesting experiments in history was called the Wargel experiment, when a small town in Austria put into effect the monetary ideas of Silvio Gesell. And Gesell's idea was that money should actually depreciate, because he said the whole hassle, and this is what we're talking about here, is that you actually, if you want money to be effective, you want it to be turned over. You don't want people hoarding and not spending and slowing down. Unless you're creating large amounts of money by things like government spending, then you want the money to be turning over. So his system was to create money which depreciated unless it was spent. Yeah. So if you leave it in your bank account, his idea was to attach scrips to notes. So when a script, you had to attach a little stamp to a note to maintain its value, and you'd only do that if you sold it to somebody else. So the transactions demand was extremely high. And Wargel, the mayor of Wargel, and I've just seen there's an excellent German movie on this front, by the way, that friends of mine translated parts for me so I could understand the dialogue. That town went from being unemployment rate of 25% down to effectively zero, because the Wargel currency, which was valid in the municipality, was being used by people that, the baker would get the dressmaker to make a dress, the dressmaker would get a house built, et cetera, Yeah. And it was actually in full employment. And it was finally shut down by the Austrian government. And of course, the final scene of the movie, which is quite realistic, though of course done in a cinematic way, was as the broken mayor, who died shortly afterwards of cancer, I believe, walked through a square time continued on, and the flags changed and they were replaced by swastikas.
Yeah, not a happy time. But I wonder, in fact, we're seeing a bit of that in the UK right now. That maybe some of the growth and spending we've been seeing over the last year or two is because people, being told so many times the pound is going to be devalued, it's going to be worth less, they're going to have less spending power, and perhaps that's part and parcel of all of this. But that idea of a currency losing its worth, being able to buy less with it, so you want to spend that money quickly. That doesn't help the 1 in 4 Australians who don't have any emergency backup. And surely it would also encourage people to say, well, this money, if I hang on to it, it's going to lose value. I'd be better off putting that money into assets.
That's again why you want to have effectively a full employment regime where nobody feels that they have that fear of becoming unemployed and being unable to pay their debts. And this is the great problem that we have when we have this obsession with in controlling the rate of inflation as the first target and using unemployment to do it. Which is one reason I'm in favour of the idea of a job guarantee. Yeah. That you shouldn't face the terror of being unable to survive if you lose your job. Yeah, that should be the job of welfare. Yeah, and that is the situation for people who don't own capital. So you want to have some way of saying even if I lose my job, my income will fall, but I won't be unable to pay my absolute basic expenses. Right. Now, if you have that terror, then of course that's going to encourage people to both hoard, to spend more slowly, which is again going against what you want to happen in a capitalist economy, leaving out the global warming side of things, but you want to have the turnover being rapid. And you also have them being inclined to go and speculate because that's the only way to apparently get positive equity. Now, they lead to crises. And that's the mindset we've got ourselves in. Yeah. The consequences of the mindset we've got ourselves in. So Mum and Dad were wrong. We shouldn't save rather than spend. But similarly, we've got it wrong. We shouldn't borrow to invest. We should just be taking our pay packet and buying stuff with it. And that's going to be the best outcome for the economy. Is that what you're saying? Effectively, but also you want to, what you want to have is effective money creation that doesn't come with a debt attached to it to the individual who receives it, which is the case when there's government money creation. It doesn't happen when you have private banks alone. So, and also the idea would be to create that stuff, again, Gazelle's idea of having a monetary system which has depreciation built in. Now, there's no bloody way in the world you could bring it into existence here, but I think there's one guy who could give it a try. Who's that? Elon Musk on the moon, on Mars. Right. One of these. They're going to need a monetary system one day, and they could design it, you haven't taken us to Mars for a long time. I know, but I thought I'd take it there for a bit of a break. It's snowing outside, so it's making me think of astronomical events for some reason. But yeah, that's the if you could design a money system from the outset, then that's what you do, because what you want to have is people relying upon income. They don't have to worry about having a buffer because they know they're going to have an income, and they're spending the income they're earning, and that money is turning over rapidly, generating large amounts of income, because if you hang on to it, it depreciates. That would be a totally different world, and I think a better one than the one we live in. Right, until we address the question of energy, which is another thing to throw into the mix. But we won't do that today. Look, perhaps we will bring up the question of energy next time, though, because we're going to look at, what is the optimum population? We'll do that next time. Great to talk, Steve. Okay. Thank you, Matt. And then the week after that, we're going to be fact-checking Friedman, looking at Friedman's theories and where he went wrong precisely. And Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize winner for economics this last year. He is supposedly a bit of a climate change champion, but we'll be looking at his climate model and pulling that apart as well. So lots to look forward to in coming weeks here on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you next time. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.